Good evening, everyone. Welcome to tonight's event of Israeli Apartheid Week in order to raise public awareness about Israel's war crimes and other human rights abuses that fit under the international law definition of the crime of apartheid. And here are our speakers. Lamis Deek, she's a Palestinian organizer born in Nablus, Palestine and raised in New York. She is a member of Al-Awda New York, the Palestinian Right to Return Coalition. She works in the field of political asylum and general litigation and witnessed the trial of Ahmed Sadat, as well as those of numerous other Palestinian political prisoners.
I think I'd like to start with the point that the right to return is not to be spoken about in historic terms, but rather it's an ongoing issue. Even as we speak, Palestinians are being exiled and killed and basically forced to leave by compulsion or other ways, and having their homes demolished literally on a daily basis. One of the clearest examples of that is in Al-Quds, in Jerusalem, where we're seeing the massive Judaization of Jerusalem, and it's not happening in any organic way. So we don't talk about the right to return as something that has happened in the past. I can go try to enter Palestine now, which is controlled by Israeli occupation forces, the entry points, and can be denied, and I would have to fight for my right to return to Palestine. It's that simple. The other thing that's important to note before I get into some of the nuances is that Palestinian refugees comprise 2/3 of the Palestinian population. 2/3 of the Palestinian population are refugees. So who are we talking about when we say, and that's not including the internally displaced. So the vast majority of Palestinians are included in the concept of the right to return. As David was speaking, it occurred to me, one of the more mainstream kind of big organizations now that's at the forefront and kind of taking the lead in the occupation Palestine solidarity work is also one of the organizations that attacked us quite viciously in the early 2000s because of our demand to have the right to return, not just theoretically, but realistically, the implementation of it, but the right to return included in our work. And we were mocked for it, on a public page. I don't know if you guys remember or were around at the time. And it's been a long time since then. Now, it's really becoming normal. It is normalized as something that we discuss regularly, just as the one-state solution is being discussed. Now, although it's being normalized, it's not as common within our lexicon, within the solidarity circles, as, for example, apartheid or occupation is. And I think that's the struggle, that's the phase of the struggle that we're at in now. This is where the next push really needs to happen. Even the right to resist has become more normalized than the right to return, and there are many reasons for that. And I'd like us to start thinking about it, maybe, I'd like to also, I did say us. So, the only obstacle to Palestinian return is Israeli violence, right? And when we say that we're going to consider what is acceptable and what is okay for Palestinians, what we're also saying is we're going to decide which forms of violence at which points are acceptable. And the answer from the Palestinians is that no form of violence, Israeli or otherwise, is acceptable. And any violence that undermines rights needs to be remedied by the restoration of those rights. And that's the heart of the Palestinian insistence on the right to return. And by any measure of morality or convenience, the Palestinian right to return is a fundamental one that is both the moral and correct one, and it is also convenient. A lot of times we hear people in the solidarity movement, or we did more then than we do now, say, well, we talk about 67 because we'd like to preserve the integrity and the safety of the Israelis that are currently living in the Palestinian lands. Well, none of that is negated by the Palestinian right to return. Dr. Salman Abu Sitta has a very detailed, several, not just one treatise, on several treatises on the the logistics of Palestinian return. And in fact, to repatriate the entire refugee population to Palestine would not require more than the displacement of more than 10% of Israelis. And that's if the Palestinians so chose to displace those Israelis. Much of the land that is being held as green spaces and parks and public areas and kibbutzim is in fact Palestinian land, and Palestinians can easily return to their homes. It's also far more convenient to have people who live a few feet in some cases and a few miles in other cases, to have people return to their homes from those areas than to come in from Brooklyn or Europe or Ethiopia, as the last push has been, or India, as the other last round has been. So it's also far more feasible to do that than to have people who have no connection to the land, other than in some abstract sense, be brought back. So it's practical. It's not something that's not feasible. Just as they walked to Lebanon and Syria, they can literally, long journey, we have cars now, and easy access to them. But and we saw, I think it was in 2008, one of the most beautiful things I had ever seen, was Palestinians from Lebanon and Syria approaching Palestine, the 48 areas, and trying to physically go back to their homes. We're seeing Palestinians who live in the 48 areas known as Israel, who are going to the old villages that are left abandoned, and they're setting up shop, like in the village Bab al-Shams, right? But we're also seeing, other projects that are getting less publicity. So there is a growing movement of the physical return on the part of the Palestinians. And it's important for us to pay attention to this, even in the context of the growing BDS movement and the really attractive, framework of that, to pay attention and to include that and their work into this, and to be creative in it. It's not an easy undertaking, but if we're conscious of it, the creative juices would flow. On a larger scale, there's some shyness, even for me, when I say it, to articulate clearly what is the goal of the Israeli, Israeli expansionism and apartheid and all of this. And there are goals beyond this, but the way that the Palestinians are being disenfranchised, and the purpose of their disenfranchisement is to institutionalize and to codify Jewish supremacy. And we're shy about saying that because we're afraid of the anti-Semitic sword, which is a real one. And so the work of Jews for Palestinian Right of Return and the International Jewish Anti-Zionist Network are really critical in this regard. So it's something that I know that I and many others do appreciate, because it gives us room to feel safe in saying, well, this is about Jewish supremacy. And one way to dismantle that is to identify what are the institutions that institutionalize that implement that. How do they implement it? Where do they implement it? Because there is one struggle in Palestine, but there's also another struggle here. There's a reason that Palestinians are at the forefront of state repression when it comes to issues related to the Arab and Muslim world. There's a reason that in the context of campus activity, there could be a whole slew of people, and the first people who are attacked are the Palestinians. This is related to the organizations that are involved in the Zionization of state policies in the U.S. And so the right to return is critical to the de-Zionization, the dismantlement of Jewish supremacy in Palestine. It is the antithesis of that, because if you don't have Palestinians saying that we reject this, then you have consent to this. You have consent to power, allowing for the privilege of the Jewish population. And even then, it's the predominantly white Jewish population, because there are rankings within Israeli society based on color and race. So it's the right to return is key to decolonization and to the reintegration of Palestine into the region. Whether we're talking about, continuing in a state system which doesn't seem very realistic considering what's happening in the MENA region, right? We're seeing slowly the deterioration of state systems, or we're working within a state framework, the right to return, having Palestinians return, is key to the organic reintegration of Palestine into the rest of the region. How we do that, what our role there is, what our role here is, I guess actually I'll save that for a little bit later. And this brings us to the idea of one state, and David had asked how this all ties into one state and what our vision for one state solution of one state would be. I mean, people finally now say, and that's another reason we often got attacked, was that we always spoke about one state. And now that's a common thing. If you're not talking about one state, you're really talking about preserving Israel or preserving a Zionist version of it, at least ideologically, because there's logistically no such thing as two states. So one state is what we talk about now, and what kind of one state? And I know some folks like Chomsky and Finkelstein like to talk about a binational state, but I'm not quite sure how that differs from a two-state, other than there would be less checkpoints. A binationalism is an attempt to preserve the separation based on religious and ethnic identities, which is how we got to this problem to begin with. And so it would be like, trying to convert to the Jim Crow South, basically, and saying that that's the ideal model. Binationalism institutionalized segregation, and it creates more porous borders, but they're still borders, even if they're political, ideological, ethnic, or religious. And it fits within the context of, as I don't know which of the speakers, one democratic state. What is, we always talk about, well, Palestinians can't talk about the right to return, they can't talk about one state. I take such offense to the idea, it doesn't make any sense, to the idea that somebody can say, well, you can't talk about having the right to go to your home, you can't talk about the right to being equal, is essentially what we're saying. And so implementing the right to return would be critical to reestablishing the equality of Palestinians. And just to talk a little bit more about decolonization and de-Zionization in the context of apartheid, Israeli Apartheid Week, and the apartheid model, legally speaking, in terms of like the legal definitions, does include the right to return. In our common usage of it, people have not really incorporated that, and that's something that we hope will happen. I lost my thought. So yeah, decolonization is where I was going. And so that's definitely part of it. I totally lost my oh, actually, yes, that's where I was going with it. Israeli Apartheid. And part of what people are familiar with are the Truth and Reconciliation commissions, right? Those are people familiar with the Truth and Reconciliation. Well, there was a step missing in that. And there was truth, there was reconciliation, but there wasn't a dismantlement of the institutions that held the wealth and the power and caused the privileging and the disenfranchising of the two populations. And our vision for Palestine would include something similar, right? So when we say decolonization, the very first step of that would be an admission and an identification, first an admission of all the wrongs that were committed without a time frame set to those wrongs. The problem with international law is it sets a time limit as to how far back you can go to pursue or implement or seek prosecution for crimes. So an admission for all the wrongs that were committed, and then an identification of all the institutions that took part in the commission of those wrongs. And that would happen both there and here. And this is where our role comes in. What institutions are we familiar with, do we know in the US that have operated to commit crimes against Palestinians, that are continuing to be part of that? You have the World Zionist Organization. You have, of course, the obvious AIPAC, the Jewish National Fund. And I think part of what we should do to take it beyond the BDS call and to really work for decolonization in a more comprehensive way, I don't want to say more meaningful, but in a more comprehensive way, is to seek out those institutions and do our best to either criminalize them or, in the very least, defang and limit their capacity to be part of the violence that continues to exile and to to attack Palestinians. And that's where I would like to see our movement going. I'm going to end on that note and maybe open it up to questions and answers. I think I went on too long. Thank you.
Okay.